everyone, and welcome back. We are once again discussing Lean In with the celebrity. Let's all lean in. We have leaned in. The task has been completed. I am here for those who are just joining our series, although why would you? All of the other episodes are linked down below, and we really, really hope that you will give them a listen. I just wanted to give a thank you to this series sponsor, DeleteMe. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for DeleteMe, now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your DeleteMe plan by texting TFC to 64000. Text TFC to 64000. That's TFC to 64000. We are here to talk about Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, which is the second of two books that we are reading as part of our little series. The first being Rich Dad, Poor Dad, My Two Dads. So last week, we kind of broke down the book. We talked about a lot of her ideas, her advice, her anecdotes. And this week, we are going to kind of talk about everything that has happened since and kind of the broader cultural context of what Lean In has done to the world that we live in. So I want to start, kind of kick us off by reading an excerpt from an article from a former Lean In girly who since has said that Sheryl Sandberg failed her.
Ooh. Was she a part of leanin.org or was she just like a Lean In practicer?
So similar to Rich Dad, Poor Dad, it wasn't just the book itself. There was also like an entire sort of cottage industry of like webinars, and people were starting groups. And the woman who wrote this article like started a Lean In group with her friends to essentially hold each other accountable and help each other to like putting the teachings in place. And she says, many people criticized Sandberg's message as elitist and out of touch when the book came out, but I didn't personally bump against the limitations of her message until something in my life changed dramatically. I became a mom. I now believe that Lean In promoted a completely unrealistic portrait of what working motherhood is like. I knew that being a working mom would be tough, but in Sandberg's cult of hard work and personal responsibility, I thought it would be nothing that I couldn't handle. I could just lean in, or as Sandberg specifically advised for working women thinking about having a baby, don't leave until you leave, meaning that you shouldn't step back from work just because you anticipate being a mother. And interestingly, similarly to this, Sheryl Sandberg actually did write a post several years. So for context, not that long after the book was published, Sheryl Sandberg's husband, who is referenced quite a lot in the book.
Oh my gosh, I knew this.
Yeah, he died tragically. And she actually wrote a post about his death that I did find very moving and tragic. And she wrote about, I went back and read it again, and she wrote about like her feeling of riding in the ambulance with him and like just like that 12-minute ride to the hospital and like getting so upset at like every car that was like not moving out of the way and all that stuff. So I do recommend reading her post about it, and we'll link it below. But she did after that do a follow-up post about engaging with her own advice as a single mom. And she basically said like, I only now realize after like the tragic loss of my husband that like, this couldn't work for single moms.
Interesting.
Which I do find like, seeing how much like the reckoning has come out since about how unrealistic it is specifically for mothers. What blows my mind is like, was there not even an editor working on this book who was like, I don't know, girl, this sounds like we can't do it unless we have a staff.
I mean, this book is like extremely, extremely reliant on partnership. Every example she gives is about evening out a like co-parenting partnership where both parents like have a desire to develop and maintain like non-traditional levels of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like never once even acknowledged or examined. The only time she even talks about partnerships that might be slightly different than hers is when she talks about lower income individuals, not even lower income families, but when one person in a partnership is making less and how like there can be pressure to remove yourself from the workforce if your like income doesn't cover childcare.
Right. Well, and she actually talks about how often women are more inclined in the short term to take themselves out of the workforce if it would be neutralized by the cost of childcare. But her position is that in the long term, it would still be better because your earning potential will increase over the time that you remain in the workforce. So like essentially sort of making that trade-off, knowing that years down the road, like you will be making more because of it.
Right.
Because
which just isn't true for all.
Which isn't true, but also like what's so crazy to me
Wait, is
about
that
it,
not true? That if staying in the if you come out of the workforce, you're probably not going to make more than if you stay in.
Yeah, I mean, her argument is that if you stay in longer, your earning potential will increase enough to eventually offset the cost of childcare, essentially.
I thought the premise is that eventually you won't need the childcare that you need for a young child, right? Like, I mean, when they're 4, you need like, that's a lot. You know, daycare goes till like 3 p.m. or whatever, but eventually you have a middle schooler who can take the bus home, and you know what I mean? Like, I thought that was like...
I think it's both. Like, I think it's her saying, like, I was just saying it's not true for, like, all people and all career types. Like, there are, you know, certain people who, I don't know, this idea that you're, like, forever on the route to, like, an executive position isn't necessarily true for everyone. I think that there are a lot of jobs where like income can stagnate a bit at a certain time. Like, I'm not saying taking yourself out of the workforce is good. I'm just saying I feel like...
I thought that she was saying essentially like, you know, you say, okay, you know what, right now I can't cover childcare, so it makes sense for me to stay home. But eventually your child, like, you know, your kid's not an infant or a baby or a child forever. Like, eventually your child will be an adult at the very least.
Well,
and, you know, I mean, it's hard to get back in the workforce 10, 12 years later. Like, that income disparity, there has to be a disparity there between someone who's taken 10 years off versus someone who's been working the whole 10 years.
Totally. And and that's true. And I don't want to like dismiss that. I just think it's, again, all of the assumptions that are being made about the type of woman who is reading this. Like, we're already talking about such a limited portion of the population. And it also like, there's a chapter in her book which reminds me of, have you guys read Fair Play by Eve Rodsky?
No.
We talk about this book constantly, but it's a banger. We should. Basically, Fair Play is a similar premise to the partnership chapter, where it's like men are not doing their fair share. You have to make sure that you're marrying someone who is going to be an equal partner and really kind of enforce that throughout your marriage and set the right expectations and blah, 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 blah. I think Fair Play, which is, so it's like, for context, it's like a high-powered attorney married to another high-powered attorney who like woke up one day essentially and realized that like, in addition to also working a full-time attorney job, she was also like responsible for all of the childcare and like even small things, but like who knows, like who does the school call? Who knows like your kids' friends' parents' names, like all that kind of stuff. So the book, and now like board game and documentary and all that, is like about kind of addressing that. But what is interesting is like, a takeaway that I got from Sheryl Sandberg's book, which I think is like very underexplored, and I think really drills down how unapplicable this is to single or lower income mothers, is like, unfortunately, truly, the man who has to be woke in this scenario, if men need to wake up, as she says, the wokest man has to be your husband, right? Like, you have to like strategically marry and cultivate a relationship where the man is bucking a lot of social trends and like he is supporting you in a very specific career ambition. And like, it just is interesting to me how much of her advice is predicated on having a very specific kind of marriage.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most interesting sentences in this book, which is true if you're going after the type of like life that she's like talking about in this book, is that she says like the most important career choice for a woman is your husband. Like, the man you choose to marry is like a key component in whether or not your career can continue to advance if you decide to have a family. And that is like true and supported by all of her examples. It's just like not that easy.
No. Well, and also like, I mean, interestingly, to talk about like the parallels with like the Tradwife stuff, like on the surface, I think the Tradwife content, which has become, I think in many ways is like a rejection of the girl boss era, and very much kind of like settling on a very different path to female security.
Well, I feel like it's because like all the failings of this book are not acknowledging like the capitalist failings of the structure that you're up against. And women, as that person said, I became a mom and it turned out everything she said was wrong. And they said, well, I'll just give up. Which is ironic because that's exactly what she's like, I'm looking around, it seems like a lot of women gave up. Have they thought about trying harder anyway?
Have you thought about leaning further
And so then women said, we tried even harder and now I want to give up even more. I used to want to be head of the PTA and now I want to be a milkmaid in the grass.
In the fields. But if you think about it, like so much of the Tradwife kind of framing is this ultimate paradigm of like your husband, because it's like always heterosexual couples. It's like your husband being not just a certain kind of partner, but a certain kind of provider. And I think like the amount that lean in kind of doesn't work if you don't have the right marriage, if you don't have the right man at home, and if you don't have the right setup with your kids, like it does speak to a way in which, because she does acknowledge throughout the book that like women are still trapped in this bad system, which I think again was like such a recurring theme of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, was like everything's bad. And we're not going to fix it, just so we're clear. We're just going to get really good at existing within the bad.
I guess, like, not that I'm not trying to defend lean in, but I do wonder.
It's okay.
Like, what would your advice be then? Don't try to find a good husband?
No, I actually.
I guess I am like, what is the, like, she is saying, by the way, if you think that you can have a guy who's kind of, I think the Trump, for example, how many women got on TikTok and said, I'm not going to tell my husband who I'm voting for. These are women that clearly disagree with their husband at the level of values. Well, like, I am like, what?
To answer
what did
your
they think was
question,
going to happen? Yeah.
No, I'm like even more like what is it, black pilled on this than she is. Like I actually think if you're a heterosexual woman who wants to marry and especially have children, all of their choices are downstream from the man you choose to marry.
And that's I agree.
And because if you are marrying a man, like when you read the stats in a book like Fair Play, or even some of the stuff in Lean In, and you see just how much a woman is hindered and held back and punished for marrying a partner who is not supportive, who doesn't take the equal share of work, who doesn't whatever, like almost nothing you can do as a woman will ever counteract that. It will never be enough.
I mean, I remember there was like a study done one time that said unless the woman's job is explicitly more important than the man's, his will always take precedence. So if you think you're in a couple where you guys have equal careers, you don't.
But also a fun fact is that where women earn more, much more likely to divorce, and the man is more likely to cheat. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say that is like a major plot line in early seasons Grey's Anatomy.
Nope. Taking us back to the real text. But no, I think it's just really interesting because like I think the real takeaway for me that really stands out in Sheryl Sandberg's book is about the marriage and partnership that you set up, because so much of the other stuff is like you're at the whim of so many people throughout every stage of this, whether you're asking for a raise, seeking a mentor, whatever you're doing. But the reality is like, if women are still in the household being expected to do all the domestic labor and work full time, like none of that matters almost. Like it'll never be enough to counteract it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we said at the beginning of the first episode on this book is like right now there is a very clear like she's able to write a very clear and concise book of like how to exist within that system where everything lines up perfectly and you can like move things in your favor. Or there's like the Tradwife lifestyle of like moving things like in an equal but opposite way still within that same system. And like there has to be a third thing, but like no one has figured it out.
Well, and also there's interestingly kind of similar to the Tradwife stuff is there's not really any discussion about, because in this scenario, in the lean-in scenario, a woman is constantly trying to optimize her own earning potential, but we basically never discuss what that looks like for her financial independence and for her autonomy. Like we're always speaking about it in the context of partnership. And it's like, for me, first and foremost, if a woman is optimizing for her own financial independence, that should be for her own protection, her own future, like her own ability to, for example, leave a marriage if it's not good, or to raise her children on her own if she needs to, you know?
Yeah, I think that's another interesting thing is that there's an acknowledgement of like a woman losing earning potential and like kind of rates of depression when they step out of the workforce forever or for a long time, but there's not an acknowledgement of like safety. Like there's not an acknowledgement of like what like the like very dangerous implications of like becoming entirely reliant on a man.
Well, and it's interesting because even in her writings that I've read, at least about her husband's passing, like there's not a ton of talk about the fact that although it was obviously a devastating, unimaginable loss, it was not a like she was still incredibly independently wealthy. And for most women, becoming single or having a child, doing any of these major life things, it is first and foremost an extreme financial burden. And the fact that that's what's so crazy too, is like we're working so hard to give women their own paychecks, but there's never an unpacking of what it means for a woman to have that level of autonomy, you know? So as someone who puts myself out there online, I am always trying to think about not just how I'm coming off online and how people are perceiving me, but how much of myself I'm actually putting out there, especially after being targeted earlier this year with some pretty scary scam attempts. And a lot of the time we are tempted to kind of brush off these scam or phishing attempts, just delete the messages and move on. But if your information is discoverable by them, it is discoverable by anyone. And there are a lot of people who are looking to find your information and then to sell it. People called data brokers make a profit by finding and selling your private details online, and all of this data hanging out on the internet can have actual consequences in the real world. In order to protect myself online, I've personally used DeleteMe, a subscription service that removes your personal information from hundreds of data brokers. On top of that, their team of experts will continuously scan for new data that shows up and get that removed as well, reducing the risk of identity theft, phishing scams, and much more. Once you sign up, you provide DeleteMe with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. DeleteMe then sends you regular personalized privacy reports showing what info they found, where they found it, and what they removed. To put it simply, DeleteMe does all the hard work of wiping your and your family's personal information from data broker websites. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for DeleteMe, now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your DeleteMe plan by texting TFC to 64000. Text TFC to 64000. That's TFC to 64000. But I also think one thing that's like kind of important to address when it comes to like the post, like a 10 years later kind of analysis is like, since this book was published, like Sheryl Sandberg has obviously left Facebook, but like Facebook has been like brought up on like many Senate hearings and has been like found to be like invading people's privacy and like harvesting data and selling it, and has been like held responsible inciting an ethnic cleansing incident. Like Facebook has like, and I mean, even for a lot of us, like to take it back to the Trump election.
I will say she's a personal advocate for ethnic cleansing.
Oh my gosh.
She loves it.
That's fact checked and true. No, but like even taking it to the Trump election, because like we read this book prior to Trump being elected, and he's been elected again. And it's like, it is impossible to overstate the role that Facebook specifically played in like completely decimating a lot of the population's relationship with truth and information, like the amount of propaganda being disseminated on Facebook. And it's like, it's interesting that her work and even her role today in the culture and just the entire kind of zeitgeist around women leaning in is, again, exists in a complete vacuum of what they're leaning into, you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what I was saying. Like, if you are not looking to question the system in any way, and I guess I also, the women I think of when I think of like who I know that are at these top, like this would be relevant to, I am thinking of women who, should they be divorced tomorrow, could support themselves like completely fine on their own income. You know what I mean? I guess I was like, yeah, this book is for a very small group of women who at 30 are on the exact same track as their male 30 counterparts, and those men might go on to be the CEO. And that's why I guess I'm like, in no way I'm thinking that this is for a woman, like an undocumented woman in this country. I am in no way thinking this is even for the woman who wants to work a 9 to 5 and mostly go to their kids' soccer games. I'm not looking for a woman, you know what I mean? Like I am like, oh, I know like there's probably like 2,000 women that this is very relevant to, or more than that. And I guess I'm like, yeah, and for them, they're not questioning, you know, the people in private equity have already committed to plundering. So like, you know what I mean? They're not like worried about, I get that they're worried about their personal gender imbalance of their colleagues, but they're not worried about the general implications of what they're doing. So for those people, this book is very relevant. And I guess there's a lot of problems when you say, well, what about the other people? I'm like, what other people? I don't know.
I guess I feel like this book, that's the problem, is like its problem is I think what it's done in like the zeitgeist and the fact that it's like this global bestseller and like led this movement, and now you can't say the words lean in without someone like referencing Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, whereas this book is for a couple thousand women in New York and San Francisco.
Exactly,
Like-
and it sold millions of copies.
I'm
is the
trying
thing.
London too.
DC, also
DC,
Singapore.
Singapore, not
okay.
LA really, but
No, they're leaning out, if anything. They're leaning all the way back. But
well, they're leaning over, but
I think there's a bit of a tech hub in Vancouver.
yeah. Okay, Vancouver's, but
it's true. But to your point, I think
But
there
in
really are
Vancouver,
only a
you've
small
got
handful.
Canadians, and everyone's willing to lean every
and that's
which
why when you
way.
say, well, this is just assuming that you have a staff, and I go, well, of course. I don't know.
But it was sold to so many women beyond that is the real
And
tragedy.
that's the thing, is I think that like the overall like concept of the book is like much bigger than the book itself.
Exactly. It's the idea that every woman in America should have been working harder.
Yeah.
As if
Yes.
women were not, when really the answer is actually women are working disproportionately harder. They need to be told to sit down a bit. They get to sit, maybe.
And I think it was also of a moment with feminism that was very like similar to like we teach women to shrink themselves, to make themselves smaller, like all of this very sort of a very, let's just say like low resolution wave of feminism that was incredibly that was not questioning itself, and that was very that took gender as just an unassailable category, which I think we've really learned since is not, because in my opinion, women like Sheryl Sandberg have much more in common with men than they do with the vast majority of women, just in terms of what their lives are like, what their constraints are, you know, how they're viewed, all of that stuff, how they're treated. But also it just takes as kind of an unquestioned good, like you said, that the problem, and similar to Rich Dad, Poor Dad, like if things are not working, they are unquestionably within your ability to change, which I think was a very uniquely toxic message to give to women, especially given that even the book itself admits how much headwind they're against systemically. Leaving aside, like I completely agree. If you are, you know, working at a very specific company in a very specific city, you have a partner who is also, you know, on a executive track and all of that stuff, this book is a gold mine. And I totally agree with that. But I think the problem, again, is where it's sold to people. And I think to take it to money in particular, like there is this kind of, when we talk to women about what they should want, you mentioned having a boss a woman who told you that the best way to ask for a raise was to describe how expensive your life had gotten.
And be polite.
And to be polite
very
about
sweet, she said.
But there is, in all, like, whether or not we acknowledge it, like almost all money career advice that targets women is like so much more about their lifestyle and so much more about everything around money. Whereas it speaks a lot to me that in a book like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or in all of these books that are targeted toward men, like I don't even know if Robert Kiyosaki has kids, but he certainly isn't talking about them in the book. Like there's absolutely literally no acknowledgement as to what it means to balance all of these other elements of your life. And yet women are being just so regularly instructed that it is their responsibility to handle all of that and keep it in mind while also managing the money.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that his book is essentially about wanting money for the sake of money, and her book is about wanting money for the sake of equality because other people get money.
I mean, I think it's a valid question to come out of this and say, well, why did she have children?
Yeah.
That's my number one question.
And I think that's like the bigger question that should be posed to more working women. Like, listen, if you're somebody who gets off on working 80, 90 hours a week and you have a partner who's also working 80, 90 hours a week, if that's the thing you love and the thing you're dreading about having children is having to take time off to be with them, then why have the children at all? She cites a study that says in the 70s, women only spent like 11 quality hours with their children a week. And now we're spending 18. And she goes, so it's fine if you're only doing 11.
Yeah, she cites a specific thing that says the children are not harmed if you only do 11. None of them are happier.
And can I say, the flip side is I do think it's very valid to say if you are a woman who works, your child isn't going to be worse off. I think you're allowed to tell women you're allowed to work and your child's not going to suffer.
I think you are, but I think fighting for women's rights to spend as little time with their children as possible is like something I think is worth unpacking. And I also think that like that question of like, why are women, and I'm not going to say her specifically, I don't know her life, but like, why are women who want these things, who are fighting for their right to spend less time with their kids, why are they having kids? And I think the real answer for a lot of them is because of some of what she cites in the book, which is that if they don't have children, they will likely be even more penalized on all of these different axes of judgment and perceived in a certain way. And for women, there is an expectation, especially in certain social classes, that is part of rounding out your life. It's a status symbol. It makes you part of an in-group, and it gives you a certain perception as a woman that without it, you're going to be judged even more harshly.
I mean, this last month, the Childless Cat Ladies, like...
Yep.
I mean, Kamala, yeah.
Yeah, Kamala. I was going to say, like, the way that she was maligned for, like, caring about her career so much that she became a nominee, like, the Democratic nominee for the President of the United States. People were like, but why doesn't she have children? How, like... It's hard, actually. You spend time with them, and it takes time.
But also, like, some women do just want to be sending emails 20 hours a day, and they don't want kids. But I do wonder, like, with the rise of the Tradwife stuff, like, are we ever going to get to a place where it's more accepted for women to just opt out of certain things? Because it was really striking to me how she has an entire chapter in the book about having it all being a myth that's damaging to women, but her main takeaway is like still do it all, just like less of it a little bit.
Well, it's something I thought was a funny anecdote is she talks about taking childless women's lives just as serious as women with children. And the anecdote she gives is somebody was like, just because I have a party and you have a soccer game, your soccer game isn't more important than my party because my party is where I have to go to meet the man, where I have a child, so I could have a soccer game. The idea that there's being a mother and then there's in pursuit of being a mother and there's no other state of being, and those are the values.
Yeah, and I also think it's the fact that there is, like, relentlessly sending emails but relenting just long enough to parent 11 hours a week. And there's, like, not even a conversation about, like, personal joy. Do you know what I mean? Like, what?
Yeah. I mean, Robert Kiyosaki is 80 years old, still tweeting 15 times a day. That's probably a low estimate, 50 times a day about crypto. And it's like Sheryl Sandberg, she's out there. She's somewhere sending an email. I know that's true.
At one point, she's in San Francisco, he's in LA, their children are God knows where, and it is like, well, what's the point of any of these people?
Yeah, she's talking about trying to, like, find equal time co-parenting when they live in different cities. And I was just like, what do you mean? She's like, a lot of it fell on me because I had to live in the city with the kids. And I was
on that note, like, it is so interesting, and again, I think it's a real parallel between Lean In and Rich Dad, Poor Dad, is at no point is money exchanged for more of what you enjoy or more time or more, like, it's never used to purchase what I think most people would purchase. Like, if you could not have the obstacle of co-parenting across the country, like, most people would choose that if they had the financial means to do so. But there's just such a resistance to ever do anything that deprioritizes advancing your career. And it's funny, I used to be a nanny for a long time, and I almost exclusively worked for, like, high net worth families. And one of the things that is talked about in books like Fair Play, and it's just, you can kind of see in the sociological data, it's like, it used to be that for a wealthy man, the status symbol was a stay-at-home mom. It was the Betty Draper type.
I always talk about the Amal Clooney effect.
And now the stay-at-home
trophy wife is somebody who's very well educated, very ambitious, but in a way that's only secondary to you. Like, it wouldn't ever take away from what you can do.
Exactly. But they also, like, they want a woman who is almost equally as ambitious, works almost equally as hard. And that was the archetype of every family I worked for, was the man and woman who sometimes even literally worked at the same company.
I one time dated this guy whose older brother had this girlfriend, and they were very on and off. And when they were off, he said, I've never met another woman with such business sense. Like, that's what he loved about her.
And listen, it takes all kinds, right? Yeah. You can like that if you want to, but it is, like, as a person who was hired by these families to, like, watch their kids 40 plus hours a week when they were both at work, and both of them were in the kind of job where you are out of the door by 7:30 and you're back home maybe by 8. It really was, like, it was just such an interesting peek into, like, man, you guys love fucking sending emails. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I feel like there's no credit given to the women. So one type of woman she talks about in this book is the type of woman who kind of, like, steps on the brakes a little bit early, where, like, she knows eventually at some point she's going to want to have kids and, like, spend more time with kids. So she leans out of her career before it's entirely necessary to. And I do think that there's, like, no credit given to the type of woman that, like, wants to have a career that she feels fulfilled by and not necessarily, like, grapple to the peak, but, like, wants to maintain, like, a work-life balance of any kind.
I guess not to defend this book, but I think I do think who she's talking about is the woman who, like, leans out in preparation for children and then has children and has been kind of pushed out by those choices.
Yeah.
And then once again, I'm sorry, but those kids do grow up. Like,
yeah,
having a child is a huge life-changing experience, but at some point those kids are gonna be 15 and they don't want to fucking hang out with you anymore.
Yeah.
And I do think there are hordes of women who felt they had to picked out, and then we're left at 45 with another 30 great years in front of them, unsure where to go next.
Yeah.
And I do think there's something to be said for saying, like, don't lean out before you have to. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, why don't you let life make decisions first before you quit the job? I mean, the big example, Charlotte from Sex and the City.
Oh, yours.
You know, our friend Charlotte. But I mean, I remember watching that episode where she quits her job at the gallery to get married.
Yeah.
And like, I'm like, bitch, what is having okay, by the way, you're going to end up infertile. You could stay at the job. You have a lot of free time. Spoiler alert to sex. But I am like, what is being a wife? Like, that man's working. Like, what are you doing? Making more floral arrangements? I do think that I do think that women have it very hard. And a lot of women did leave and then turn around and say, fuck, I am not in the workforce. And now I have a 10-year gap. And I don't know what to do with myself. I mean, I worked on the Upper East Side where I watched a lot of women quit high-powered jobs to become full-time mothers. And unfortunately, their children could not take on the amount of attention that a case study could. And you could see that I was like, I don't know what they're doing with, like, they're about to explode because they've opted out and now they don't know how to get back in.
Yeah, and I also do feel like that the type of woman that I was talking about is more affected by, like, the lore of Lean In than the book Lean In. Because I think that the concept of Lean In is not very specifically, but, like, fairly specifically targeted more at those types of women. Like, I think that the concept of this book and not the book itself, like, in the way that you're saying this, like, actual book is specifically for, like, women who are climbing the ladder in, like, business cities. Yeah. In a very specific point in their, like, early 30s. I think that the concept of Lean In for our country was, like, very much targeted at women who, like, wanted work-life balance.
Well, it's funny,
and stayed in the workplace in a way that is now deemed not good enough.
I remember my idea of this book was based on this idea of women should be saying yes to everything. Like, be on the board of the BTA, say yes to the promotion, say yes to coaching soccer, say yes to baking home goods, say yes to being your own housekeeper. And I'm like,
that's Tori Spelling.
But, like, that's actually not what this book is saying at all. It's funny, like, Lean In is like a misnomer.
Yeah.
Yes, I do agree with that.
Because I think she almost is specifically saying, don't worry about the PTA, call in on speakerphone if you want.
But I think one of the most insidious normalizations of this book is it just reinforces, because let's be clear, she's not out here being like, well, maybe your husband should be a stay-at-home father. You know, there's not an exploration and unpacking of what it, like, okay, you don't want to take maternity leave? How about your husband takes paternity leave? How about, like, there's just such an implicit assumption that not only are you a woman who wants a career, but you are married to a man who also wants one. And that, I think, because we've moved, I do want to acknowledge what you're saying, which is that there are women who lean out and regret it or who want more of a career than they have. But if you look at the surveys and if you look at the socioeconomic data, the majority of women who are in the workplace while having a child want to be working less, at least while that child is young. Like, it is an economic necessity now for so many families to have two parents in the workforce when that is not what they would choose. Often because the cost of childcare immediately erodes what they earn. But the paradigm that this book pushes, and I think did a lot of damage in the cultural zeitgeist, is really emphasizing the opt-in choice of both parents being extremely high-level workers and working extremely long hours, totally optionally, totally voluntarily, and taking it as a given that if the woman is working, the man is also working.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when she says her husband sold his company and then went on to, like, live in a different, I was like, well, he sold his company.
Like,
what a
he's
perfect
done.
time to be a dad.
Right?
Why is he now just like farting around in some venture capitalist firm, like thinking things?
Because these men don't want to be around the kids. A lot of these men in these corporate environments, they don't want to be spending more time with their kid, kind of period. And you only have to work up close with a few of them to understand that a lot of them would rather do a million things before go home and do story time with their kids. And I think a really big misalignment is like, your question of like, when he sold his company and made a fortune, why is he now living in another city, like doing all this work? Why not be a stay-at-home dad? Because he doesn't want to be. And the tragic thing is like, a lot of the women who are emulating this, they do want to spend more time with their kid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like that is another like untalked about version of the mentor, like another side of the mentorship coin of like now men want to be married to like ambitious, high achieving women instead of like it's a status symbol. But like women have, I feel like, rarely even considered the idea that like societally they would be allowed to be like seeking men who are lower in ambition than them.
Oh yeah. That, I mean, as we mentioned, like the stats around things like divorces, infidelity, etc., skyrocket when the woman out earns the man.
It's like the real version of the height thing. I feel like there are people who like people that are taller than them or shorter than them, and of course there's like a societal standard that like the boy is taller than the girl, but like overall it can mix up a little bit, whereas like earning potential,
I
feel
disagree
like-
with you. I feel like these are almost probably identical stats.
But I
Unless
think-
you're dating like Carolina Korkova. I would
was
love
gonna
for you
say,
to
I
show
think-
me the short guy, tall girl combo frequently.
I think that I'm just saying, I think that like there are people who like, because earning is like a little bit less like physically visible, I think you could think that you're okay with it much longer than you're actually okay with it. And then
Well,
it
it's
breaks
the
apart
men.
immediately.
Statistically,
Yeah,
it's the men who are not okay with
That's
it.
what I mean. No, it's
Because
yeah.
what's so interesting is I feel like Miss Sandberg would have a lot of interesting things to say about the fact that these men are often feeling this way because of the way society views them and the way that they judge them. Like stay-at-home dads are judged. Men who earn less are judged. Men whose careers take the back seat are judged. Like there isn't a win there. But I do think like to just like as a final thought on this whole thing, it's like I agree with you, Claire, that like there is a handful of women smattered across 20 cities in this world where this is a banger. Like this has everything you need. And like it's true. But what's crazy to me is that like for as much as it applies to just such a small group of women, I think even today we are still very much unraveling what it means, like what all of this meant for the young women who were fed it. Mm-hmm. And on top of it, like when I see that the way that the anti-intellectual, anti-liberatory, tradwife, anti-feminist, super regressive, like the wave of popularity that has, to me, it's like when I read this, I'm like, I'm going to get an egg apron too, girl. Like that's more appealing at some level than just me and my husband both sending emails 80 hours a week until we die.
Yeah, the fact that she spent this book like really giving herself a pat on the back for leaving every day at 5:30 except Mondays and also except for all the other days. I was just like, oh no, it never stops.
But maybe, you know what we didn't consider that we could unpack next time is maybe Sheryl Sandberg's kids have bad vibes. And that's why both parents were constantly trying to get away from them.
They had no insight, no algorithmic insights.
Yeah.
So Claire, Ashley, it's been a delight and a pleasure having you guys hang out with our community. Please tell our audience, just as a last reminder, what you guys do and where they can go to find it.
We are Celebrity Memoir Book Club, so we read a celebrity memoir every single week. And we are everywhere you listen to podcasts, even YouTube, even if you watch a podcast.
Yeah.
They're on YouTube now.
We've actually always been on
TikTok.
YouTube,
Oh, I'm
but
sorry.
it's one of those industry best kept secrets.
It's the truth they don't want you to know. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining our series. And who knows, you might catch us back here another time reading some more dastardly personal finance books.